Welcome to this latest video. In this video, we're going to be exploring where Russia has foreign military bases. And foreign military bases are, in a way, a proxy for global power projection. And so the USSR used to have a ton of foreign military bases. We're going to take a look at how many Russian foreign military bases are left from that USSR inheritance, because much like many European colonial powers whose foreign military bases collapsed, their presence collapsed post colonial empires, so did Russia's after the USSR collapsed. So let's explore, where did the USSR have military bases? Where does Russia have military bases? Where does Russia have a military presence? That's not the same. And here I'm more specifically talking about Wagner Group, which is a Russian paramilitary organization, and the Africa Corps. And then how does Russia's presence compare to other global players? And where is Russia going to be expanding its foreign presence? So which countries is Russia negotiating to open up new military bases or open up a naval port or an air base to Russia? And then at the end of this, we're going to take a look at what conclusions we can make of this. So the first slide is the USSR military foreign base presence in Eurasia and Africa. And so we see that in Europe, it has a very strong military presence all the way up to Germany, even in Finland for a couple of years after World War II. So that entire Soviet sphere of influence in Albania, even into Austria, which was not immediately a neutral country, it was still partially under Soviet control. This is all as a result of World War II. The Russians came in from the east, whereas the Allies came in from the west. So wherever the Russians came in first, they had military bases there. We see that in dark red is the whole USSR. We see that there's a military base in Syria, one in Yemen, one in Ethiopia, and then in East Asia, we see that it's present in Mongolia, in China, in North Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Not surprisingly, Vietnam and Cambodia, two communist countries in Southeast Asia. And then the last one that I haven't mentioned is Afghanistan. Russia did invade Afghanistan, or the USSR did invade Afghanistan near the end of the USSR. So we can see that it has a huge presence beyond the USSR in Europe and especially in Asia, not so much in Africa, but definitely we can say the USSR was a global superpower. I'm not even looking at the bases it had in the Americas or in Southern Africa or in other regions, because I want to focus now on in the next step where Russia had military bases or has military bases. So how does Russia's foreign military base presence compare to that of the USSR? And in this next slide, I've marked in yellow all of the countries where Russia no longer has a military base, where the USSR used to have a military base. And we see that there is a complete retreat out of East Asia. Obviously, China is now a far more powerful country than Russia is, whereas in the USSR times, it was an opposite relationship. Vietnam, Cambodia no longer need a Russian presence. We see strong retreat out of Central Asia. Half the Central Asian countries no longer have a Russian military presence. The ones remaining are Kazakhstan, where there's the Baikonur base. There's in Kyrgyzstan a large airfield, I believe it's called Kant airfield. And then Tajikistan actually has one of the largest Russian foreign military bases in all the Russian military bases. In the Caucasus, we see that Azerbaijan no longer has a Russian military base. That makes sense. It's probably the most developed of the Caucasus countries in the sense of it has large gas and oil supplies. It also has a strong alliance with Turkey, and so it has someone who can protect it, which is no longer Russia. And whereas Georgia does have military bases, not because they want to have Russian military bases, but because Russia has military bases in South Ossetia and in Abkhazia, which are two independence movements which Russia has supported after its invasion of 2008, right, into Georgia. And then Armenia has military bases because they do want Russian military presence there. This was in the context of the Armenian-Azerbaijani war, and Russia was sort of the security guarantor of Armenia back then, or still should be. And that is why there is a Russian military base in Armenia, which is also part of the CSTO, if it hasn't left already. And in Europe, we see a complete retreat out of the majority of Europe, but we see a base in Moldova. That's the Transnistria separatist movement, which is supported by Russia. And then that's a small military base. We see that Ukraine obviously has a Russian presence / base. It's under invasion. It's being invaded. The same thing that happened to Georgia is happening to Ukraine. And so therefore, obviously, it has hundreds of thousands of Russian troops within its borders. And it has several regions which were even annexed officially by Russia. And then Belarus also has a large Russian presence. In fact, it can be debated whether it's still fully independent, since Russia actually invaded Ukraine via Belarus. Belarus is a very small country, and it wouldn't be able to really defend itself against Russia if Russia would decide to formally annex it at any moment in time. And beyond those, Syria, we all expected them to get kicked out of Syria after the regime change, in particular since Russia was such a key part of the bombing campaigns on Syrian civilians throughout the years, a decade even. So really had a negative impact on the average Syrian civilian. However, right now, they are still able to use that naval base in Tartus because the new Syrian government, which fought Assad and the Russians for years, has decided that at the end of the day, money and maybe security guarantees are what matters. And so that's why that base is still there. And then we see a complete retreat out of Africa, right? So there is no longer any Russian presence at all in Africa, or formal Russian base within Africa. But the picture changes quite drastically when we don't just look at where Russia has a formal physical base, but when we look at where Russia has a military presence, and more specifically looking at the infamous Wagner Group, which is a paramilitary / mercenary organization run by Russia. And so the Wagner Group has now split up into Wagner Group and the Africa Corps, which focuses on Africa. And it's in the name. It's sort of a play on Nazi Germany's Afrika Korps, and that's why we have now Russia's Afrika Korps. And so where is this Russian military presence felt? So we know that Wagner is present in Ukraine. It was very present, in particular in the first years of the war. It was very innovative in developing certain tactics at pushing the Ukrainians back, and especially in the Battle of Bakhmut, Wagner really developed a name for itself in that battle until the fall, when Wagner tried to take out Putin in that 2 or 3 day or that 1 day campaign or rush towards Moscow. We know that Wagner has a military presence in Belarus as well, and we know that Wagner also has a military presence in Syria. So those are places where military presence exists, but these are also places where Russia anyhow has a military base. So where is that military presence felt where Russia does not have a military presence? And we see this big fat red arrow, and that's sort of how I wanted to show you. It's all about Africa. So Russia is really completely focusing on Africa with its Africa Corps, speaks for itself, but with Wagner. And we see a strong presence in Libya, where there is still a civil war with multiple parties backing different leaders. So I know that one is called General Haftar. I believe that's the one that Russia is backing. I'm not exactly sure, but I know that Turkey is backing one side, France is backing the other side, the UAE is backing a side, Russia is backing another side. So that's Libya is right now sort of a game of chess by many of the Mediterranean powers and even beyond, right? And then we have in Mali, we have a presence in Niger. We have a presence. So Mali is the one, the Wagner logo furthest west. Niger is to the right of Mali and below Libya. Burkina Faso is the little Wagner logo below Mali. And then we have a large logo in Sudan. I'm sorry, the map is a bit old here, but that's sort meant to indicate Sudan, not South Sudan, where there is also a civil war, and the Central African Republic, which is below that. Pretty much, I think most of these countries all have a civil war of some kind or a conflict going on. Then we have below, not in the map, also a Wagner presence in Mozambique, which also has a civil conflict, and Madagascar, which literally just had a regime change 1 week ago. So there was a putsch on the government, and the French had to fly out the government. And so my high level first indication is this Wagner presence in Africa, so this Russian presence in Africa, really likes to focus on this very poor Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa belt, where there's a lot of poverty, where there's a lot of violence and conflict, and where there is a way for an infection to take root, right? Where things aren't working very well, or where the government isn't very powerful and strong, that's where Wagner is able to get inside and put its virus and survive, right? And many of these countries are also countries which France has retreated out of. Generally, many of these countries were countries where France had a lot of influence. Well, France has in the past years left some of these African countries because the new government did not want any French presence any longer, and that's when in that loss of military presence, that's where Russia moves in, right? And that's a interesting finding from this slide, how strong and how big of a focus Africa has actually become for Russia. So when we put those two graphs together, the existing bases and the military presence, now let's take a look at where our future bases planned, right? And here the new color is green. So green means there is a planned base or an under construction base. Yellow means a base is under discussion, or a cooperation is under discussion. And purple means there is a new base planned in a country where there is already a base. So going through the purple ones first, there's a new base planned in Belarus. There is also a new military base planned in Georgia. That one's interesting because it's actually a new naval base. That's an indication. It would be the furthest naval military base that Russia has from Ukraine. And in that sense, that's quite strategic in Abkhazia. It's likely in order to be able to put its Black Sea fleet even further from Ukraine's naval drone reach, right? Secondly, we have in Syria, they're also building a new base or planning a new base, a place where they already have a base. And now looking at the new ones planned. Essentially, all the new ones are literally in Africa. There is no other place that any military base is planned. First of all, Libya. In Libya, there is already a strong Wagner presence, and now there is a discussion they're looking at, in particular, the airfields, right? Modernizing, expanding, and taking over those airfields in Libya. But this also allows for a backup against Syria. When the Assad regime fell, there was a lot of discussion that likely Russia would shift towards Libya. And this might be what it's doing. It's preparing, still getting a backup military base within Libya. Secondly, we have Sudan. Again here, they're trying to set up a naval base in Port Sudan, right? And so this is in order to have a key naval base along the Red Sea. They're also in discussions with Eritrea for something very similar, also along the Red Sea. And then finally, the last planned military base is one in Central African Republic. This is a very large non-maritime, non-airstrip base, which is planning to have 5 to 10,000 Russian troops when it gets constructed or completed entirely, right? And then there's 3 military bases under discussion. First of all, in Egypt, this is a deal in order for Russia to be able to use the Egyptian airfields. The first discussions or indications of discussions on this were pre-Russo-Ukrainian war, so I'm not entirely sure if those discussions are still ongoing, since it would probably be a quite bad PR hit on Egypt, in particular since Egypt is more of an American ally than a Russian ally. And then the next two are Mozambique. I put it in yellow, but many indications are that it's well underway, and Madagascar also under discussion. There's also some suspicions that Russia actually already has a military base in Mali, but I could not fully confirm that one. I just read 1 or 2 articles which indicated there might be a non-official Russian base in Mali. Again, we do know that they have soldiers there with the Africa Corps and Wagner, but likely we could assume that Mali is also on green. Let's put it that way. But to conclude with this slide, my key takeaway is that the vast majority of these bases are obviously in Africa, but where are they in Africa? Many of them seem to be located along key routes. The Mediterranean in the case of Libya, the Red Sea in the case of Port Sudan and Eritrea, and then we have Abkhazia and Tartus. So these bases are all set up along key trade routes, and it's not a good sign when Russia is establishing more and more military presence along trade routes which Europe and the rest of the West are using, right? It's sort of establishing leverage that they could do something against all trade in the case that there would be a larger escalation of the conflict. As always, in my videos, I like to show you guys the raw data that I'm working with. If you want to look at this, please pause, but generally in the top table, you see all of the existing military bases with the estimated number of personnel. And in the bottom left, we see all of the countries in which Russia is under negotiations or in discussions, or where a base is planned to be constructed soon. But the main graph here that I find interesting is the number of bases and planned bases in each region of the world. And we see that Europe is at 19% of the bases. We see that Asia is at 38%, and I'm including Georgia and Armenia as being Asian countries in this statistic. And then we see Africa at 44%. And so when we would compare that to the USSR, that is a big difference. Whereas in the USSR times, Africa was basically almost negligible or not important at all. And it was all about Europe and Asia at almost 50-50 of the bases. Now that's changed entirely. It's all about Africa and Asia, but even more about Africa, right? If those once those bases come online, and if those bases come online, Africa will outnumber Asia by quite a significant margin. And in this next slide, what I wanted to do is sort of visually indicate how many actual Russian troops are present in each country and region. And I did include the formal Russian troops, but I also looked at the estimated Wagner presence. Bear in mind, these numbers are a bit on the iffy side. But so if we would assume that those numbers are correct, we see that in Europe, the vast majority of troops are in Belarus, because that number has expanded quite drastically since the Russo-Ukrainian war at approximately 13,000. We see a small Russian military base in Transnistria in Moldova, bringing Europe to a total of 14.5 thousand. This number is very incorrect, since I didn't include the hundreds of thousands or millions, who knows how many there are right now, in Ukraine. So if I would have included Ukraine in this graph, it would have been far, far, far higher than any other country here, obviously. Next, we see the largest chunk is coming from Asia at almost 30,000. Armenia has 4,000 troops. Georgia has 8,000 troops. By the way, check out my Caucasus military presence video if you want to take a detailed look at the Caucasus. But so Georgia has 8,000 Russian troops on its borders. Then we have Kazakhstan with approximate. This is a rough estimate, but Kazakhstan with the Baikonur base, 1,000. Then we have Kyrgyzstan with 1,000 in the Kant air base, and then Tajikistan 7,500, by far one of the larger ones also. And then Syria 8,000. That's normal Russian troops and Wagner troops in Syria. And then the smallest one right now is Africa, and all of these are actually Wagner Africa Corps troops. None of these are fixed bases. So we see 5,150 estimated, and this number is the one that is the toughest to verify, but 5,150 Wagner Africa Corps troops in Africa, the largest countries of which are Libya, Mali, and the Central African Republic, right? One of which is 1,000, the next 1,500, and Central African Republic at 1,750. And Central African Republic is the one which is right now under discussions to build, as far as we can tell, the largest Russian military base in Africa, which is going to host 5,000 to 10,000 troops. So that number in Africa could triple simply thanks to that Central African base. And we're not even including, we don't even know how large the other military bases are going to get. If Libya is really going to host a large airport or a large naval base for Russia, what is going to happen with that Sudan port Russian military base, etc., etc. What is going to happen with that planned Eritrea base, Mozambique, Madagascar? There's a lot of bases that are going to be built up along the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea, as well as some of these inland bases like the Central African Republic, Mali, Niger. Maybe these are more interesting from a minerals perspective or from a airport perspective. If you can control an airport in the Central African Republic, you can basically fly to every single country within Africa quite easily. And so let's put those Russian military bases in perspective with other countries. And so what I did here is I simply counted the number of countries in which each country has a military base. And so for Russia, that number right now is 9. When we compare that to the US, that's far less than the US. US has 28 countries in which it has a military base. I'm not counting bases, I'm counting countries here. So Russia has 9. Turkey has 12, so quite a large number. The UK at 9, like Russia. France at 9, like Russia. Italy at 8, surprisingly quite a lot. China at 5, Germany at 5, Saudi at 3, UAE at 3, right? And when we actually include the ones that are planned for Russia and the ones that are under discussion, there are 5 military bases planned for Russia and 3 under discussion. That would shoot Russia up to 17. And as I said previously, all of those are in Africa. So almost half of the Russian foreign military bases in the near future will be in Africa. That actually makes Africa quite a significant battleground. I know that Turkey is also having a base in Africa. I believe half the countries on this list, if not all, have a base in Djibouti, which is the #1 military base country in the world, apparently. Even China has a military base there, even though China is quite reluctant to have foreign military bases. So what conclusions can we take from this video? First of all, Russia has lost a lot of influence in Asia and in Europe since the fall of the USSR. However, recently it has regained also military influence in Europe, namely in Belarus, where it now has a much stronger military presence since the Russo-Ukrainian War, and obviously in Ukraine itself, where it has made ground since 2014 across Ukraine that it did not have before. So that can be said objectively is a push forward in terms of military influence in Europe as opposed to before. Secondly, what is also interesting is that despite the regime change of Assad, Russia has still managed to maintain that Tartus military base, something which was highly speculated they would get kicked out of and would get pushed likely towards Libya. That did not happen yet at this stage. Next, we can see that all the major developments for Russia are actually all in Africa. Everything is happening in Africa right now. And we can say that wherever France leaves, Russia enters like a plague. And mainly in these very poor sub-Saharan or Sahel region, unstable countries that are in conflict like Mali, Niger, and the Central African Republic. And we can also say that there is a large focus on gaining military influence and negotiating for military influence on maritime corridors and airport access, right? The vast majority of the planned military bases or under negotiation military bases are set up strategically along maritime trade routes in the Mediterranean, even in the Black Sea with Abkhazia, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, right? So Russia has a clear strategy there to secure its way out of the Black Sea, out of the Mediterranean, down the Red Sea, and towards its allies in the east, which are China and North Korea, and Iran. Next, we can say that the 21st century, in my opinion, is likely going to be the African century, right? It's benefiting from a huge demographic boom, which Europe had post-industrial revolution, which East Asia had in the past 20 to 30 years, for example, China, but Europe, it's over. China, it's about to be over that demographic boom. Latin America and the US are all also going to be declining demographically. There's only one region in the world which has so many young people, and that's Africa. And so it will likely be a driver of the majority of the growth of this century. And we can see that China, Russia, Turkey, and the UAE are all getting in Africa in a big way. They're all going in there along the Red Sea, in Libya, and in the sub-Saharan region. And whereas France and the US are on the retreat out of this region. And they're being replaced by other powers immediately, pretty much instantly when France leaves the country, immediately a Wagner presence enters. And this Wagner model actually lends itself very well to work with warlords and dictators in Africa who, in exchange for security or support in their local wars and their local conflicts, they give Russia access to strategic locations along coastal regions, along trade routes, or in terms of influence, or in terms of assets, for example, key minerals that Russia wants to control. This is also something that China is doing from an economical perspective. Russia is doing it with a military perspective. They're taking over mines, they're taking over these key assets in exchange for the security they provide to these warlords and dictators. And so I think this is sort of a alarm bell that we need to be aware that where the West is pulling out of Africa, other countries are more than willing to step in. And the question is whether their motives are necessarily good or better than Western motives, right? When France is asked, can you please leave the country? We don't want your military presence here anymore. They oblige, but what happens is instead the Africa Corps comes in, and who knows what their plans are with the country, because I doubt that when they will be asked to leave, that they will actually leave the country. If you like this video, please leave a like, please leave a comment, and please subscribe. These videos take a lot of work, a lot of research to complete, so I would really appreciate it. And so to close out with a channel update, My current subscriber count is 589. That's 17 more than the previous video. That's a 3% growth, and I would say that's okay. Yeah, I'm slowly going up, slowly going up. What are my future video topics? One topic is artillery barrel wastage. So how quickly artillery barrels will break with usage, and also what is the production rate of new artillery, right? Because that will give us an indication, maybe that's a bottleneck actually for Russia or Ukraine. And I also saw that you guys are so interested in the oil refineries topic. Oil export terminal hits might also be something we're taking a look at. And so finally, let's take a look at some comments. Iran said the refinery status bingo card. She loves it. We all love the refinery status bingo card. And she says that I have a tendency to hit the table sometimes. I'm trying to avoid it because apparently my microphone somehow picks that up. She said, Iran also says that in my next video, actually the microphone installation is working good again. That's not by intent. Maybe I positioned it differently, but unfortunately my microphone is set up in a getaway. It's connected, it's tied here to my table. So when I hit the table, I guess the shockwave goes up all the way into my microphone. So I'll really try not to be hitting that table too much. And then I thought this was a really interesting comment by No Name on the oil refinery hit video. This guy seems to know a lot more about oil than I do. And so essentially, he's saying he's never learned about Muscovite crude oil specifics. The Caspian oil is very heavy and toxic. If I remember right, very high sulfur, for example, it can only go to refineries made to handle it. To really get a sense of what is going on, you have to know what crude goes where, how Urals blend is made, and the capabilities of the Chinese and Indian refineries the oil is going to. In other words, these strikes may be far more damaging than you realize from barrels per day numbers alone. If Siberian oil can't be pumped, it will freeze and destroy the oil field. So production has to be shut down. When that last happened, when the previous chapter of the Muscovite Empire collapsed in 1990, it took decades to restart the oil fields, and only with the expertise of Western oil service firms like Halliburton, which are gone and will never return, and since they took massive losses when they left. So the Kremlin, as a result, must keep those wells flowing, which means they must sell the crude at ever lower prices, which means a few more strikes on key oil terminals would force shutting of more oil fields in the winter. All right, so what I find quite interesting here that I did not know is that each type of crude oil needs to be refined in a refinery that is specifically made to refine that type of oil. That was something I did not know or had no idea about. And indeed, that does mean that if some of these oil refineries are hit, even if you can pump out the crude oil, it does not mean you necessarily find someone or something able to refine it. So that's something new for me. So indeed, the impact could be larger. And if oil wells are shut down, because when they pump out the crude oil, there is no refinery capable of refining it. If you would shut down that oil well in the winter, the oil well freezes, and it's very difficult to reactivate that oil well. And that's what No Name is trying to say in this situation. And finally, we have John Quigley saying the best breakdown I've seen about the oil refinery video. Thank you very much on that. And on the right side of the screen, you again see my books, AI Revolution, which is a book about AI, short stories, a bit like Black Mirror style. And then we have 3 Lives, that's a World War II fiction. If you have liked, if you've commented, if you've subscribed, and you do want to support me more because my channel is not monetized, feel free to buy one of those books on Amazon. The link is in the description below. Thank you so much.